regarding the Trump immunity case. It was not decided on today, so we're still awaiting that, but still so much more to talk about. And for that, I'd like to bring on our legal analyst, Neama Rahmani. Neama, thanks so much for joining us. Once again, we are on Trump Outlook, but still other things to talk about. And many of these decisions, these cases, some people are not familiar with. I'm just going to go through the list, maybe detail some of these decisions. The first question I really have is the opinion of the State versus Munoz case. So maybe a little bit of context on what that's about and how it could affect immigration here in the U.S.
Well, it was an important decision, and we're talking about an individual who was denied a visa to come to the United States because of some alleged gang tattoos, specifically MS-13. And historically, the courts haven't been able to really get involved in those types of decisions. Really, it's up to immigration officials to decide who gets to come in the country and who doesn't. And you really don't have a whole lot of rights, especially if you're not a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, to demand entry to the United States. But the Ninth Circuit said that really this was unconstitutional, and it denied the applicant the right to essentially the right to marriage. And it was a very surprising decision. I wasn't surprised that the Supreme Court justices reversed it, because it really is inconsistent with how immigration law has been handled in this country. And it was a 6-3 decision, but an important one that's going to really give immigration officials the authority and the discretion to deny folks based on what they believe to be criminal activity, even though this specific individual didn't have any criminal history in the United States.
Let's move on to this next decision that they gave, Erlinger versus U.S., invoking the Fifth and Sixth Amendments for a unanimous jury. Could this apply to cases outside of the Armed Career Criminal Act? And again, a breakdown on what this is, because so many of these cases, I'm sure some people aren't too familiar with.
Yeah, so this is another important case in the criminal procedure world. And it goes back to a pretty important Supreme Court case called Apprendi. And Apprendi said that if there's going to be an enhancement that's going to give someone more time, that's something that has to be found by a jury, not a judge. And that because everyone has a Sixth Amendment right to a trial by jury. So the question is now, if someone's going to be an armed career offender, if you're talking about criminal history, is that something that needs to be decided by a judge or a jury? And that's something that the Supreme Court justices ruled on today.
Next, we're going to continue with the Smith versus Arizona case and how this could affect the use of forensic evidence in a trial.
This case, I did not read this decision. I got to confess, Carol, I got to get caught up on it. I didn't read the court's decision on that one today.
No, you're fine, because again, so many of these different decisions and so many cases that they're hearing out, we're just kind of getting like back to back on that. But let's continue on with some more that maybe we can speak more in depth on. Here, speaking on the opinion of U.S. versus Rahmani, applying to cases of gun rights. Familiar with this one?
Yes, this is a very important decision. And it's U.S. versus Rahimi, not to be confused with my last name, Rahmani, but it's a very important case related to gun rights. And a lot of folks thought that the court might go the other way. This is an individual, Zachary Rahimi, who is a drug dealer. And because of some issues with his girlfriend, had a domestic violence restraining order. And under the law, people like Rahimi cannot own guns. And we talked with the Ninth Circuit how liberal it was in the gang tattoo visa case. But this case went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is very conservative there in Texas. And that Court of Appeals ruled that the law violated Rahimi's Second Amendment right to bear arms. And this is a very important decision, not just in this case, but it actually affects Hunter Biden as well, because Hunter Biden, of course, wasn't accused of domestic violence, but he was charged and convicted of being an addict in possession of a firearm. And that same conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals there in Texas, they issued a ruling in a separate case, the Daniels case, that said that if you're a marijuana user and you're no longer an addict, then the law is unconstitutional as applied to a former addict. So we know that Hunter Biden's lawyers were pointing to that Fifth Circuit decision, and they were hoping for this Rahimi decision to be favorable for them to attack his conviction. But it was bad news for both Rahimi and Hunter Biden. The Supreme Court, in a pretty surprising decision, 8-1, not the decision itself, but the fact that it was overwhelmingly in support of this law prohibiting the possession of firearms by those convicted or those who are dealing with a domestic violence restraining order. Really a big win for gun control advocates and probably a step back for those who take a very broad view of the Second Amendment.
I want to stick a little bit still with this decision based on the Rahimi case here and the wording temporarily disarmed. What does this mean in this ruling? How important or significant is it when kind of dissecting this going forward?
So yeah, obviously restraining orders, even a quote permanent restraining order lasts for years. It's not permanent like a conviction might be. So to the extent that someone is subject to a restraining order during that time period, one of the standard conditions is you can't possess any firearms. Now, obviously, a restraining order can be renewed or it can be terminated, either based on a motion or a judicial finding, or just it just lapses because the time period runs. So what the court said is, during the temporary time or even permanent time where someone is subject to a domestic violence restraining order, they can't possess a firearm. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're banned for life, like someone who is convicted of a felony, maybe, depending on the facts and the law in each state.
And then, Neema, I do want to ask because you mentioned a little bit about this 8-1 decision facing this gun rights case that the Supreme Court was hearing. Any other case that you were maybe surprised by that ruling or the decision, how the justices were split, pertaining specifically to today's decisions?
Not necessarily today's, but obviously in this case, the Rahimi case was 8-1, Clarence Thomas being the lone dissenter. But the abortion case from last week, where it was unanimous. Now, I know it was based on a standing issue, but obviously abortion is a hot button issue. We all talked about Dobbs and that decision when it came down and how divisive it was and how really polarized the American public has been, as well as the Supreme Court. But for them to issue a unanimous decision in that case saying, the doctors that are challenging this law and the FDA's administrative processes to approve these abortion pills, they don't have standing to do so. Now, it was a very narrow decision on standing, saying that really the doctors have no injury. If they don't want to perform abortions or prescribe these pills, they don't have to. But it's rare to see a unanimous Supreme Court decision nowadays. So that one was surprising as well.
Okay, Neema, finally, let's kind of look ahead because today, possibly we were awaiting this Trump immunity case decision. It didn't come down today, so we may be seeing it next week. Why has it taken so long for justices to come to a decision on this? And I did read some articles regarding this, some powerful words from justices saying that they're taking their time because whatever they decide today, it really affects the presidency going forward. What do you think of that? And does that play a role in why it's taken so long for us to know where they're going to rule?
It does play a role. And really, we're talking about unprecedented times and uncharted legal waters. I mean, we haven't had a criminal issue involving a president since Nixon. And of course, he wasn't prosecuted. All the other problems that presidents, current and former, have had have really been civil lawsuits. Paula Jones is accusing President Clinton of sexual harassment, obviously Donald Trump, and the civil lawsuit, defamation from Jean Carroll. But criminal prosecution of Donald Trump is the first, and it may not be the last. And that's one of the public policy considerations and constitutional considerations the justices are talking about. If Trump is reelected in November, does he turn around and appoint an attorney general to prosecute some of his political opponents? So I think the Supreme Court justices really want to get it right. I don't think they're going to say that a president is blanketly immune. That was one of the arguments that Trump's lawyers made, and during that famous oral argument before the D.C. Circuit. And what one of the appellate judges asked is, well, if Trump were to, call up SEAL Team 6 and have him assassinate his political rival, would he still be immune? And I think that's a bridge too far. I don't think any of the justices will go there, but the D.C. Circuit said that there was no immunity for a former president. I don't think that's going to fly either. I think the justices are going to be very careful to outline a rule that is going to say when immunity applies and when it does not. And I expect that, well, a lot of folks do, based on the question presented, to be presidential immunity applies to a current or former president if they're acting in their official capacity, but not in their personal one. So the question is handling classified documents, is auditing or potentially challenging an election, is that personal or official? So we're going to really see an important rule, and I think it's going to be one for the ages, because it's really going to determine if and when presidents can be criminally held accountable. And this is something that we haven't addressed in probably 70 years since Nixon, and it's probably going to be the law for decades to come as well.
Waiting on that historic decision indeed. Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor, also legal analyst for us here at Live Now. Always appreciate your time helping us break down these decisions. And again, we're still looking ahead to this immunity case. I think it's the one that we all have our eyes on, and we look forward to discussing it with you once that comes down.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, we're going to step away for a quick commercial break here at